Hey folks, welcome to episode 103 of the podcast. Seems like such a big number all of a sudden. This is the final episode for 2019. I'll be back in 2020 with new episodes starting probably in the second week of January, depending on how lazy I am after the holidays. I also want to remind people that the Patreon is one of the things that really supports this process and makes it happen. It facilitates creating transcriptions as a point of access for people who otherwise might not be able to get access to this material. And of course, it supports me doing this work and continuing to carve out the time, energy, and space and to make that happen. As part of that, every episode going forward is going to come with extra content only for the Patreon supporters. Barbara and I recorded an extra 9-minute piece about fate and destiny and how to divine if fate and destiny is going on in your life around a specific issue. It's a very practical piece that we didn't get into in the actual podcasts, but we're sharing it with people on the Patreon. So if you are not already supporting the Patreon, maybe you want to jump over to patreon.com/thehermitslamp right this second. Go sign up. Go make a pledge. It really does help. And, as they say, it all adds up. It doesn't need to be a massive thing. Even a few dollars helps, although the exclusive material is available at the $5 level. All right. I've talked long enough. Here comes the show. Welcome to another episode of the Hermit's Lamp podcast. This week I am catching up with Barbara Moore just before the end of the year for our annual podcast episode where we check in on what's going on, what's changed, and, talk a lot about the shifting perspectives in our spiritual lives and practices and so on. It's hard to imagine people don't know who you are, Barbara, certainly anyone in the tarot world. But for those who don't, who are you?
Oh, I forgot about this part of the interview. Yes, my name is Barbara Moore. I've been playing with tarot for, maybe 30 years now. I'm probably best known for a couple of things. One, creating tarot decks and writing books to go with them, and a few standalone books as well. And I'm also the tarot acquisitions editor for Llewellyn, and I sometimes do some work for Lo Scarabeo as well. And I teach here and there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, I guess, one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you was, it seems like for me, everything's changed, since our last podcast. I have gotten divorced and my ex has moved out. I had a fire that burned down my store, and I have since reopened and, opened a studio to see clients out of and opened a new store. And so for me, it's been a massive year of change, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you follow the tarot birth card, year card business, as my death card just ended at the beginning of the month. But it's also been a year of, or at least a time of change for you too, right? Like you're also maybe not quite where I am on the other side of it, but really sort of setting in motion a bunch of change for yourself as well, right?
That is absolutely true. This cycle of change I'd say it started back in 2016, and it has ushered in a period of challenge and becoming stronger and having things ripped away to find out what really matters. And as your listeners, if they've been listening to our conversations, know that 2 years ago I moved to California. My wife and I moved to California, and we've been having a great adventure as well as a lot of challenges and struggles. And we have recently come to the conclusion that this has been a really fun adventure and we're grateful that we had it, but it's time for the adventure to be over. And so we will be moving sometime this summer. So that is a really big change that we can talk about. It's not like having a store burn down or having a divorce, a relationship, a marriage end. But our relationship also has gone through some struggles. Luckily came out the other end stronger and better, richer and deeper. But it's still, we're both like two different people now. So it's almost like a new relationship because we're learning to be together in new ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that people always say is something like what you said. Whenever they start talking about their own thing, they're like it's not as bad as your situation or whatever, right? And I mean, on the one hand, yeah, maybe, right? Like I get that, but also I think it's really real how difficult struggle is for people, right? And I mean, there is tragedy and loss and people dying and all those kinds of things that, no joke are very difficult. Right. But I think that it's really important to not diminish our own struggles too, especially in the face of that. Right. Like there's no scale, there's no competition, and maybe other people feel differently if they're in positions like mine, but I actually feel like just relating around stuff is so much better than when it starts to kind of slide into, areas where it's like, well, it's not as bad as your life, but whatever. And it's like, yeah, that doesn't feel so great. And now I feel like there's this sort of other element to it that doesn't need to be there, So
like a competition or something.
Yeah, competition or a sense of apology, I mean, I feel like if I know somebody well enough to talk about my life and their life, then we're on the same ground, right? And I think everybody understands that some things are more difficult than others from a certain perspective. But either way, I think it's important to sort of just keep that relationship open, and not, I don't know, create that distance that sometimes comes with that for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Like, how did we as a people start doing that? Because it really is habit. And I feel like it's a little bit like social behavior niceties, because when I'm not talking publicly, like in a podcast, I would talk about what I went through in terms of, now that I'm through it, and I can see the other side, when I look back on it, it was so hard. I don't even know how I got up every day, So to say to you, oh, it wasn't so bad, if I talked to you privately, I would be like, oh my God, I don't know how I did that, So you are right. We are equal terms here. It's been hard.
Yeah. And life is difficult, right? I mean, not all the time. Luckily, there's great things, I mean, one of the things that was interesting was being at the tail end of the summer, and I was checking in with the kids just before they went back to school this year. And I'm like, how was your summer? Right. And they both gave it like rave reviews, and they're like, well, how was your summer, Dad? And I was like, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. And like those two missing points are because like relaunching the store during the summer was a ton of work and very stressful. And like just dealing with all the stuff that came with that was very stressful. And I was like, man, I do pretty good at having a good time despite all this, horrible stuff that's going on and all the stress that comes with it. Right. But that also doesn't mean that there weren't days where I was like, oh my God, I have no idea. Is that just it? Is this, am I done having a store? Is this over? Is that over? It's complicated. And when we lose that direction, right? I think it's been challenging, and I think it's been a long time that you've been sort of wrestling with this sense of direction. I'm thinking about, we talked somewhere in one of the past episodes about probably before you move out there, right? When I did that impossible reading for you, and you were like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to do all these things now." It's been quite a while in some ways, I think, right?
Yeah, I have, especially in terms of my tarot career, well, in a lot of areas of my life, but in terms of my tarot career, I have felt really lost, so lost. And and there are a lot of elements to that. I should have wrote notes. One thing that changed is I wasn't working with tarot for myself. I wasn't reading for other people either. I quit doing that a while ago, for mostly because I didn't feel like I had enough to give. My cup wasn't full. I couldn't fill anyone else's cup. And I wasn't working with the cards for myself. So starting in January, I started pulling a card a day, because that's like, where do you tell beginners to start? And I would do it, and I'd mark it in my daily journal, but I never did anything with them. And so finally, but it was enough. I mean, all I had energy to do was that. And that was a start. I was touching my cards again, and that mattered. Then when things started taking an upturn, I added something like, okay, I want this daily draw to do something more than just get marked down in my book and mean nothing but use ink. And so I decided to start pulling 2 cards a day, and and making them mean something. So the first card was some energy that I was going to find myself into that day, whether it was something that happened or my attitude, something, just the energy of the day, something. And then with an eye to improving myself or becoming the person I want to be more than I am, I pulled another card. How can I interact with this energy to do that? And that has been super helpful. That's made a big difference and made things more active for me in terms of like doing something with the cards. So, that's just a little thing, but it's made a big difference. I am so sorry about that. And I also had been thinking a lot about, like, I've been questioning the whole doing readings thing, right? What do we do readings for? What's the purpose? Or, these mundane readings about our everyday problems. Oh, how boring is that? Or is that even the right thing to do? I mean, just very angsty kind of pointless spinning my wheels questioning. And then, I was thinking about, we were going to talk, and I thought I'd like to talk about that. And I had a kind of a revelation. I'm not sure if it's going to stick, but it's a thought that because I want to do readings about different things or in different ways or with a different focus, I had to denigrate those readings for some reason. I think maybe it's human nature sometimes to make ourselves feel better or more confident. We have to put down something else for whatever reason. And so even just that thought made me feel a lot better about things. Like, oh, well, just because I don't want to do that and just because I want to do this, that doesn't mean the other is bad. I don't have, does that make any sense?
Yeah. Maybe a year, 2 years ago, I was sitting doing my not daily draw, but regular draws. And I was like writing in my journal, and I found myself writing something like, well, when I'm free, blah, 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 blah. Right. And I, for whatever reason, on that day, as opposed to the various other days I'd written something similar, I stopped and I looked at it and I was like, well, when is that going to be, and what does that look like, right? And I'm like, at the time I was in an open relationship without a huge amount of limits on it. I mean, some, but not, I'm like, it's pretty darn free. I'm like, you own your own store and you work for yourself. Like, what is it that other people are defining for you or that are limiting for you, right? And, and the answer became pretty clear that it was very little, right? Not nothing, but very little, right? I still have to pay taxes. I still have to, whatever. There are certain things, but, and I spent a lot of time sort of chewing on that for a while and realizing how often, movement, change, these ideas was sort of created on continuing to define myself in relationship to other things that actually had no sway or real say over my life, right? If I decided, I'm a very fortune teller orientated card reader, but if I decided that I had enough of that and all I wanted to do was psychological readings, I could just change my website and filter people based on that and inform them when they tried to book that, this was the process going forward, and that would be it. Like there wasn't a lot of things that prevented me from the various things that I was sort of waiting to become free enough to do. And so since then, I spent a lot of time keeping my definition and directions in check, right? Like really looking at them and saying, okay, am I defining this relationally? Am I in relationship with some idea that I'm not actually interested in or don't want to live by, and so on, and it's not always easy, but I think it's really helpful, right? To sort of look at those pieces and say, your practice has no bearing on day-to-day type questions, right? Your practice doesn't need to have any relationship to the way I read or other people read, or the whims of the tarot community, and this year, next year, or 10 years from now,
Yep. Yeah, knowing what you want cleanly and being realistic about it and not just finding excuses, that takes a lot of self-reflection and honesty, but will really make a big difference in how you feel about your life in this moment.
So how do you generate that self-reflection? You're talking about tarot as one part, your tarot practice this year. How else do you talk? How else do you figure out? Because one of the things that I think it's a bit of a theme, I think, with some episodes. It comes up in various places. But this idea of like, how do you know when you're done, right? How do you know when enough's enough? How do you notice that change, mark that change, and so on, right?
Yeah. And like, if we could come up with a format, a step-by-step format on how to get yourself to that spot, we could probably be millionaires, because everyone wants to know that, I think. Because at least for me, I have not come up with a method that like walks me to the spot where I can step over the line out of, the mists of confusion into clarity. I don't have that. For me, it has been, it has felt like waking up. Like I've been either asleep or underwater or walking through jello or something. And I don't realize it at the time for that. I mean, I know I don't feel right. I know I feel confused and unhappy and no energy, but I don't really fully understand that state of being asleep or underwater until I start coming out of it. And then I see it. And then I start thinking, I don't have to be that way anymore. And so when I can, it's like this pivotal point, this space where like a liminal space between what has been going on and what could be. And I have this opportunity to keep behaving the way I had been or changing the behavior. But before that, I don't know that I could have changed the behavior. I don't know that I was in a place where I could have done that. So for me, it's this point where, or at least how it feels to me right now, is I can't wait to get started on the next phase. And I haven't had that excitement, energy, or enthusiasm in 2 years. So how do I know? It's vague. I don't have, well, maybe as we keep talking, I'll think of more concrete things, but to start the conversation, that's what it feels like for me. What's it feel like for you?
I mean, lately, so like in the last year, I've been noticing where I'm not putting energy that I officially think that I'm putting energy, right? Where do I feel a difference between, something that I'm excited about, it doesn't make it difficult for me. It's not difficult for me to show up and make art in my studio. Making art is great. I mean, it requires having some time, and it requires, ideally not having sick kids at home or whatever, like certain things. But it's pretty easy to make that commitment. I've been sort of in and out of relationship in terms of polyamory this year a bit. And one of the things that I noticed around some of that was where I was willing to put in a certain kind of effort or show up in a certain way in one situation, but not in another. And to me, that starts to be like, okay, so if I'm willing to make the extra time or hang out with them if they're sick or whatever, but with somebody else I'm not feeling that as much, then those kinds of decisions start to be little flags for me. It's like not necessarily that it's the end, but that something needs to change there, right? Or something has changed there, and I need to sort of look at that, right? And I think that I don't know that we ever notice the moment, right? Like I don't know if there's a barring like really, and then I said something and then they smacked me in the face and I said, we're done. Like, unless it's like ridiculous and dramatic, which is, never really in my life. I don't think that we ever notice explicitly those moments. I think that we can notice when we're wobbling along that line, and then we can sort of reflect and see what's coming or what makes sense from that point,
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. You're right. It is hard in these things to pick a point, as you said, and for most of it's probably more like a process, that it takes some time. And, but sometimes even within that process, you can find like little mini points, like I remember admitting to myself, because we had already started talking about how California wasn't right for us. And so the question was, where do we go next? Mm-hmm.
Is the answer Tijuana?
The answer is not Tijuana.
Okay.
I found myself not being super excited about thinking about where to go next. Mm-hmm. I knew I didn't want to be here, didn't know where I want to go. So I kind of made myself think about that. And in that moment, I had this realization that hit me very hard. I want to go home. And that was hard to admit and hard to feel and hard to know, because I knew it wasn't going to fly for us, my marriage, our family, just the two of us were a family. Because we didn't want the winters. The winters in Minnesota are just too much, and we're not ready for that. But just knowing that one of the things I learned during this adventure is my family and my Minnesota friends are very important to me, like more important to me than I knew before I left. Mm-hmm. And so that was a mini, moment. And then when I actually told Dylan that was another moment, because it was scary to say that, or for me, because it was like, can't believe I'm going to say this, because one fear was, what if she says, okay, let's go home, and then I'm stuck in Minnesota winter again? But anyways, so yeah, these little mini moments of revelation. Oh, another thing that I've noticed, I don't know if you've had this too, but now that I feel like I'm being more honest with myself, that we have some more clear direction on what the future is going to look like, synchronicities are happening. Like, I can barely take a breath without something helping me feel like I'm on the right path. And I've heard people talk about that, well, if you're looking for it, of course you're going to find it. Some, cynics might say that, and other people might say, well, yeah, that's a sign that you're on the right path. I don't know if I quite go that far, because I'm not sure what I believe about the right path thing. Fate and destiny, that's going to be a focus of study this coming year. I'm very excited about it.
Well, you know what's funny? I have those as list at the top of my list of things I want to follow up on in this conversation: agency, force, destiny, and free will. So we can set some explorations on it in this conversation, and then a year from now we can report back as to where it's gotten. So yeah,
absolutely. Totally. Yes. Right. So synchronicities, I find them comforting and encouraging. So whether they're actually real or not, it doesn't matter to me right now. I'm taking my comfort where I can get it. Sure. And it's helping. So,
and I think that, first of all, I think, as the song says, whatever gets you through the night, I think that finding comfort where we can is always, as long as it's not too self-destructive, I think it's always a great move, right? I think that, this year of sort of moving through the fire and doing that has definitely been a year of, more indulging and comfort-oriented behavior than is usual for me. And I'm just like, you know what? Life is freaking hard right now, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. And I'm just going to, lean into that wherever and whenever I need to, So there's been more naps, more ice cream, and more TV this year than would normally be a thing for me, because sometimes that, for me anyway, that's part of getting through these times, right? I think that, so synchronicities are a thing that I am very interested in, especially because it's often touted as the explanation of how tarot works also, right? You shuffle the cards and the universe through synchronicity arranges them in a way that is meaningful. And it's kind of fun and fine as an answer, unless you try and say, but what does synchronicity mean? How exactly does that function? And, is there anything behind that? And then all of a sudden you just slide into utter chaos of inexplicable mystery. Right. And I think that that's fine. For me, I'm mystery is the answer, right? I'm tarot runs on mystery. That's all we need to know about it. Exactly. Right. But so I think that synchronicity is, lots of people, are really into numerology, and, they're people come for a reading and they're like, I've been seeing lots of 888 lately, or triple this or triple. And I'm always like, that's cool. What does it mean? And, and then they'll often say a thing followed by the question, which is usually, so when is that going to manifest? Right. And so, and I don't mean this to make fun of people. I'm not at all. Right. Absolutely. There are those moments where we're oh, there's a sign. Okay. Where's the product? Right. Where's the actual outcome of that? So, and sort of more and more over time, I've been looking at what it is that I believe, how I approach things, and thinking about, people always ask me well, so what's the astrology in the Orisha tradition, right? What's the astrology in your Orisha practice? And I'm like, there is none. It doesn't exist, right? It's not a part of it at all. There's no, no consideration given to it in any real sense. There is notions around times of day a bit, depending on what we're talking about. And if you practice in a syncretized kind of way with the saints, then maybe certain orishas have their day, right? Where many people celebrate them extra. But there is no astrology. And I've been noticing this sort of growing tension for me between like astrology, which I stopped reading this year and stepped away from and decided that I was going to actively not engage anymore. And the way in which I was feeling stressed and tense around that stuff some. And the fact that it's not actually a part of my religious practice at all, right? And kind of the same with like some of the synchronicity stuff. There have been times in my life where I was very intent on that kind of stuff and, thought about it and wrote about it and had a bunch of experiences with it. And now there's basically only one symbol from the universe that I'm interested in. Well, there's a couple. One, but the synchronous thing, or the thing that I think fits this way, is if I find a playing card on the street, then for me that's a message, and I will interpret the card based on my knowledge of reading them, and we'll go from there, right? The other thing that is synchronous, from a certain perspective, but I see it as more directly as a message from spirit, which kind of has a different definition in my mind. So like 3 months ago, maybe a little less, I broke up with someone that I'd been with for a long time. We decided to change the nature of our relationship. And it was very kind and very honest, and and the relationship has changed into a really good friendship, which is lovely. But about 2 days after that happened, I found a robin's nest on the ground with 3 dead eggs in it, like broken eggs, right? And I was like, everyone's like, oh, nests are so. I'm like, no, this was just sad and unpleasant, right? And I was just like, yeah, that's definitely acknowledging like the depth of the disruption that's happened here. And so, I picked up the nest and I saved it, and, it's around still. And then maybe 2 weeks ago, I was walking through this laneway that I identify with a spirit that I work with a lot. And there was a pigeon on, like, sort of flopping around a bit with this, what looked like a branch wrapped around its neck. And I'm like, oh, how am I going to free this poor bird? Is it going to let me get close enough to liberate it? And as I got a little closer, the bird, I realized, was actually holding on to the branch. It was not stuck by it. And it flew up, and it flew directly up over my head, circled maybe like 5 feet above my head 3 times, and literally dropped the branch into my hands.
No.
And I was like, perfect. Now there's a new nest. Now I'm going to build something new. Now I've moved on. Internally, I've moved on, right? So to me, these are events that I take as close to synchronous as people usually mean by that, right? Direct message from somewhere else, right? And to me, they are clear and concrete and so on in a way that, not to diminish anybody else's experience, but that those other kinds of symbols, I'm not sure what they mean, right? At least in my life, And so, yeah. But also, there have been plenty of time in my life where I'm like, oh yeah, I saw that number again. I'm on the right path. And I think that that's fair too. I think I just have a different relationship to it now, and I have a different set of expectations maybe. So.
Yeah. Okay, great. That all makes sense. And I love the story about the pigeon. Oh my God, I'm still stuck on that. Yeah, so synchronicity, like levels of synchronicity, or is it synchronicity or is it a message from the divine? Are they two different things? Those are really great questions. I think I agree with you. I think there's a difference between them. And like synchronicity, I mean, I think the actual definition of it is like two disconnected things that seem to have a connection. And I think that we humans are the ones who give that connection or give that meaning. So maybe why it's comforting to me is because if I see something that brings to mind something else that's connected with what I'm doing at the time or going through or thinking about, it just helps remind me that's where my attention is. Mm-hmm. So, maybe it's just a way of like stoking the fire. Like, yes, this is what my intention is. This is what I want to think about, but on a kind of more subtle level or something. Mm-hmm. And then, messages from the divine then I think are kind of different. You mentioned finding the cards, specifically playing cards on the street is pretty funny. It reminds me of Dylan has something that she has always called parking lot divination. And she started it when she was a book cover designer at Llewellyn. Now, as you could imagine, the trash cans, the big garbage bins outside of Llewellyn sometimes would have cards in them for, if a package got damaged or whatever. And so sometimes I guess they would blow around and she would always walk around the building, for exercise every day. And so sometimes she would come across these random cards on the, and she would always pick them up and she would read them as a divination. And she still does that to this day. And she finds a surprising number of playing cards just out about in the streets. It's very strange. So yeah.
They're definitely around.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's funny is I almost never find a whole deck. A couple times I have. And often I'll find them clustered for periods of time, like I will find different cards in different places for a couple months, and then I'll find nothing for 6 months, and then I'll start finding them again, which is also to me interesting. Yeah.
I have another kind of a symbol story, and, does it mean something or does it mean nothing, or did I give it meaning or whatever? That it's a story I wanted to tell you, at some point today anyways, because it's very significant to me. Okay, how to tell the story. Okay, so Dylan is not going to be here at Christmas. She's actually flying back to Minnesota for Christmas. So I'm going to be here alone, which is great because I have a whole, personal retreat planned and ritual and all kinds of crazy, great stuff. But because of that, we did our little personal celebration on Sunday. And but we had agreed on no presents because of reasons. And but she said, but I do have one present that I actually started the process for it a few months ago. So there'll be the one present. I'm like, okay, I can let you give me a present. No problem. Uh-huh. And so the backstory that you need to know to understand the present is when we got married, she gave me a necklace. And it suited me perfectly. It was meaningful and it was beautiful. And we both loved it. And it was like a symbol, one of the many symbols of us. Uh-huh. And, in May, we were out at the coast. I was taking a watercolor class and we'd gone together, and I brought the necklace, but I don't sleep in it. So I, just take it off and I, put it somewhere. Then, long story short, it got left in the hotel. And when we called the hotel, they're like, no, it's not in the room. So I mourned that necklace. I cried. It felt symbolic. It felt like, oh my God, our marriage is, It was just made me so sad because things have been hard. We're working through some things, and I just took it as this horrible, horrible omen, and it just broke my heart. And the company, we couldn't find, it looked like the company didn't make the necklace anymore, so I couldn't even get a replacement, and it was just horrible. Well, so Christmas comes, present time, she gives me so she brings me a card and a little present, and I open the card and I start reading it and I start bawling because she's written some stuff that is breaking my heart in a good way. And she's like, well, since you're crying, hold on, we'll just keep going. And she goes in the other room and brings out a different package. And I start opening it, and it's wrapped in this kind of a gift baggy thing that we've had for years, and we only use it for very special gifts. And I
That's
saw
really
this.
Sweet.
It is.
Yeah.
But we haven't used it in a number of years because, it hasn't been like that. And so I start opening it, and then inside it is a bag from Arthur's Jewelers. Arthur's Jewelers is the jewelers in St. Paul where we got like our wedding rings from. And if we ever get like actual real jewelry, which we don't have a lot of, but we get it from them. And so I saw the bag and I'm like, she got me jewelry. What? And then all of a sudden I knew what was in that bag. And I have never ripped a package open so fast in my life. And it was the necklace. And I saw it, and I cried like my soul was, I don't know what was going on, but I've only cried like that, like maybe 3 times in my life. And, it felt like a symbol, like a sign, like, okay, like you lost it. You guys were in the 3 days of death or the 3 days after death, like, in the bowels of hell fighting the demon. And now you're done. And now you have the same, it's a new necklace, but it's the same necklace. So it's kind of like our marriage. It's in the same marriage, but it's a new marriage. And it was hard won. And until I lost it, I didn't realize how much it meant to me. And, so I felt like the necklace was always symbolic. The loss of it was symbolic. The reacquiring of it was symbolic. So, that's another thing entirely, was that divine? Was that something I don't know. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is probably always really complex, right? I mean, people talk about like the fire, right? Me having the fire, and they're like, well, maybe it happened for a reason, so you could whatever. And I'm always like, I don't buy that answer at all, right? I mean, that said, right? I think that, like many things, I hold sort of contradictory ideas about it, right? And in myself, they seem fine to be contradictory, right? I know that, in some ways that the fire must have been a part of my destiny in some sense because of the advice of the Orishas in the time around it, right? We have this kind of source of negativity, which is otanawa, which means that which you brought with you from heaven, right? And sometimes it means that literally. Maybe sometimes it stands for things that just can't be changed and we have to work through in one way or another. But, this was part of my advice from the Orishas around that time. So I'm like, well, fair enough. Something was going on there in that regard. But also like the idea that, I talked about this, I think in the last episode too, with Chiron Armand, the idea that we are always progressing towards other things or better things and so on. I don't necessarily believe that either, right? I think that, we can look at people's lives and see that doesn't happen sometimes, right? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And the reasons for that are, complex and, and always a bit obscure as well, right? Why does one experience sort of break a person in a way that they don't recover from? And why does it, just deeply bruise or wound, or maybe not even apparently sort of injure another person, right? There's such a diversity amongst us all, and why that is the case, right? But for me, I look at these situations and I think that it becomes a question of, there's, if we want to call it fate or whatever, those experiences that are beyond our apparent control, right? Or that are the unexpected byproduct of decisions that we have made, maybe in the case of a relationship, that might sort of give the appearance of fate, and might coincide with synchronicities, right? That moment when you lost the necklace and it cued you to, all of the bigger changes that were going on, right? And then there's the question of what do we do with it, right? And I think that is also, such a big distinction, right? And like me ending up in the situation that I'm in now, which is in many ways more ideal than the situation I was in with the store, or where the store was at the time of the fire. On the one hand, yeah, it's great that it's sort of working out really well. But also there's a lot of it that's really, was already in my 2-year plan. Like I was already thinking about these ideas and working on them. And so some of this transformation, I'm just going to take credit for by saying, look, I had these ideas that because of the concreteness of having the store were going to take me a long time to make shift, that in some ways the fire basically just liquidated my assets into cash and allowed me to transform it, and applying it towards those plans. There's that sort of balance of agency, free will, and the intersection of fate, right? Because I think that what we do when things happen is important and makes a big difference in that. And I think that the more we cultivate a capacity to make good decisions during those times, the better that can go, and so on, right? So I don't know. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but.
Oh, yeah. Well, as you say, these things get confusing to talk about. So yeah, I think in so far as it can make sense, it totally makes sense. But and kind of connected with that is, the idea of like judging something as good or bad. Okay, it's kind of connected with the idea, it happened for a reason. Well, I mean, first of all, almost everything does happen for a reason because cause and effect exists, and so there was a reason. But I know people are talking about a grander reason than electrical faultiness or whatever. So things happen for a reason. Things happen is what it is. And trying to judge whether they're good or bad, I mean, we want to do that because that's what we do, because we're binary beings, I guess, like, oh, that's good, that's bad. I mean, people always say is what they think. But you can't always tell if something's actually good or bad in the long run until time has passed, because there have been things that I went through that I wouldn't want to go through again. Mm-hmm. But I'm glad they happened because then XYZ happened. Not saying it happened for a reason, because it didn't magically do anything. It also ties kind of into what you're saying, your own agency, your own preparedness, your own, strength of will, whatever you want to say. You can bring that to it and turn things around. But it's also one of the things that puzzled me about these, more everyday readings, like people are like, well, I'm thinking of taking this job. Should I take this job? And I mean, I don't know about you, but like, if I'm looking into the future, I'm not real comfortable looking more than 6 months out. I just don't. And, so if I'm, do a reading and it's like, well, yeah, the job says this, this, and this, and maybe some things they consider not good. And then they don't take it. But if they took it, then it would have led to X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. So, we don't always know. We think we know what we want in the short term. We think we know what our goals are. Oh, I want to manifest this. I want to do this. If the cards say it's all going to be positive, I think we lose something in that, because not everything we do has to be completely positive or successful to be worthwhile, or to be part of a larger journey that might be more worthwhile.
Right.
That makes sense?
It does. I mean, I think that the question of one of the questions that I've been thinking about for a while, specifically around, my work life, is like, what's enough, right? At what point am I successful enough? I mean, but put it in really basic terms, at what point am I making enough money? And what is it that I would like from going beyond that point, right? And I think that, working for yourself is not like kind of getting into a job description position that you like and just sort of being like, perfect. If I just stay in this job until I retire, that's great. Because working for yourself doesn't really work that way. And I'm not sure the economy works that way that much anymore anyway. But, but I think that we have these sort of notions of progress, of enlightenment, of, all those kinds of ideas that are, cultural to capitalism and, like cultural to North America and so on, maybe, that I think are questionable how helpful they are, right? Like I don't know that, like, mostly what I'm interested in is making art, making more art, and doing the things that supports that, right? And like I love running the store, I love doing readings for people, but I think that, like, the idea of it sort of going anywhere, I'm like, well, I don't know where it goes and what the definition of where it goes and what the grand plan is. I just want to, do my practice, which is, making art and reading cards to people, and just continue to do that. And I think that, that you're right, that it's hard to say on a big arc of time what might be good or what might be difficult. Like if we take a job, maybe it's crummy for 6 months and then it's great after that, and so on. But I also feel like the idea of persevering through stuff towards an outcome, I'm really less and less interested in that these days. If the exchange isn't good in the short term, then I'm not really that interested in sort of engaging in that to get to a theoretically better long term, and I think a lot of people, especially around relationships, right, sort of try and work through stuff, to get to, especially newer relationships, right? Like maybe if you've been with somebody for a while, as you have been, that, there's a different math around, like, well, I was involved for this long, and so now I'm willing to commit a longer stretch of time to working on things. Right. But I think that for me, I'm like, I'm not that interested in working on very much these days in those kinds of ways, and if something isn't flowing, I haven't seen the value of spending the resilience and capacity on working hard at stuff that is difficult towards accomplishing longer term goals without making a change, right? I think about it like Crowley talks about the strength card or the lust card in his tarot deck, right? And I think that he draws a distinction in his writing on it where he says that lust is not the absence of effort, right? It's not the absence of exertion. It is the absence of noticing the exertion, right? Or something along those lines, right? And that idea that, if we don't mind the work, then we're not going to notice it, right? And if we do mind the work, well, then maybe that's one of those cues to make a change, right? Yeah.
That's gorgeous. And if you're following, if that's kind of a guideline that you're following for your life right now, as you were saying, then you probably wouldn't be doing readings on things so much, because if you're like, I'm going with how things feel now, you are attuned enough to yourself to know what so you probably would need less readings because you're paying attention to your energy and how you're feeling and what you're doing and the effort and the payoff. Is that true or not true?
That's true. True-ish. I mean, I think that there are always practical considerations that are difficult, right? Dealing with insurance companies after having had a fire, it's like, man, nobody wants to insure you, right? It's like, it's difficult. And so there are always practical questions and, questions along the lines of, is there anything that I can do to make this better, to make it happen? Especially because I have a very strong practical, magical practice, right? So there are those kinds of questions. But really the question that I ask more often than not these days is either something along the lines of like, well, should I run my Tarot de Marseille class in January, or should I run my other course, right? Like very sort of strategic business kind of things. Or the question I go back to most of the time is, how do I show up fully today? How do I show up fully in this situation? Right. And, and for me, that's a question that I've kind of come to answer by a sort of multi-step, open-ended kind of practice, right? Like I no longer just kind of, if I'm going to read cards for myself in that way, I don't like just draw a card or two cards to the answer. I'll usually start with drawing a playing card, checking in with my guides and ancestors, drawing 3 trumps from a Marseille deck, reading those in light of what's already been set in motion in the early part of the reading, and then drawing a card from my Land of the Sacred Self Oracle that I self-published, and doing some writing on that, and then usually photographing that and then doing drawing back into it and embellishing it further. And then at some point that feels finished. So like that's the process that I do when I do that stuff. And, it's all, if people were to look at it, which I'm not going to share it anywhere, but anyway, if people were to look at it, you'd be like, wow, I don't know what sense this makes a lot of the time, because a lot of it is very nonlinear and very, like a lot of channeled writing, and so on. But at the end of the process, I'm like, oh, now I'm aligned for the day. And now I know how I stay aligned for the day, or for this project or whatever. Right. So,
Yeah. Well, and that sounds like a good process. And I think like I've heard people, say, oh, I can't read for myself. And I think sometimes part of that is they don't read for themselves the way they'd read for somebody else. Like they give themselves short shrift. They won't go through the whole process. They just throw out the cards, look at them, go, and then pick them up and put them away. It's different, I think, if you treat yourself as if you were how you would treat a client.
For sure. And I think if you're going to read for yourself around practical considerations, you just need to have a lot of discipline, right? For me, when I read for myself around practical considerations, it's actually usually really short, because I'm like, like, whatever. The Tower card says, this is a horrible idea. Don't go down this road. It's like, it's the end of the conversation. Just stop there, because the more I talk about it, the more I might try and talk myself into it, or think that I have agency where the Tower says it doesn't, and so on and so on. Right. So, but for me, it's like, there's a short list of sort of core meaning that I would attribute to every card, that if I'm going to read for myself, I'm going to hold hard to that no matter whether I like it or not, or whether it even makes sense or not to me, and be like, all right, cards say that someone's going to really betray you here. 10 of Swords. It's like, well, all right, let's not go there then. Where else am I going to go instead? What else can I do?
Yeah. I think that's important too, when you, especially, like your first practice was more of a internal, deeper kind of a reading, and now we're talking about practical readings. And I think one of the reasons we want to do a practical reading is because we want to bypass our head, because we keep thinking about it and we keep justifying, and we know we're justifying or making excuses, and we know we're making excuses. So you do this reading and keep it short and hold yourself to it. It helps bypass all of that. But you're right. If you start thinking about it, like, well, the Tower can be, how we can sometimes spin things.
I mean, Carl Jung thinks of buildings as being a symbol of our ego and our persona in the world. Maybe I just need to change the way I approach this so that I can, have a different experience of this. And then I can learn and grow and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, still going to get hit by the lightning. Definitely don't like that. Thank you, but I'll pass. Right?
Yeah. Or someone wants to know, I started dating someone. How is it going to go? 5 of Wands. Oh, it's going to be so exciting and fun. And, it's like, one of the exercises I would give beginner students is for reading for themselves is, okay, before you do a reading, the question, your question, and what answer you want. Yeah. Go through the deck and just if you don't already have the meanings like you have for reading for yourself, this is new people, go through the deck and, pull out the cards that you think would make that answer. Yeah. And then shuffle your card and make note of them. Then shuffle your cards again and then do your reading. And then if, the 2 of Cups, 10 of Cups, whatever doesn't come up, it can be like, well, okay, this isn't one of the answer cards. This is a different answer. And it's a way to kind of discipline yourself, which is what you said when we started. Sure.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, it's like, I think that approach is, really helpful for a lot of things, right? And especially for, not everybody reads for everything, but I do, right? Like I don't really have limits around what I'll read for the most part. So like if someone's like, well, am I going to get pregnant? Right? Am I going to conceive? Well, I have a short list of cards that answer yes to that, right? There's only like 3 or 4 of them, depending on the deck I'm working with. And if those cards don't show up, then I'm going to say the cards don't give you a solid yes, right? Yeah. And, same with questions. People are like, am I cursed? I'm like, happens. Magic is real. I believe it, but there's only a couple of cards in the deck that are going to answer affirmatively to me around that. And my expectation is that the mystery will surface those cards so that the answer feels unequivocal, And I think that that's also a practice that is a bit hair-raising when people are starting. But I think that, as we talk about it, I realize how many different kinds of questions I have a very short list of cards that I would take as a solid answer to, and I think that that's a really helpful way maybe to avoid feeling ambiguous about the readings that you're giving, right? So, right. Yeah. All right. Well, maybe, is there something else you want to add? I see you looking like you're going to.
Yes, there's one, I kind of said that I was going to be studying Fate and Destiny in the coming year. The other thing I'm looking forward to is over this past year, I've heard a couple of people refer to mythic living. Like, I should know what that means, and I don't. And I've asked a couple of people, well, what do you mean by that? And I kept getting this idea that it was like where you just live really big and loud and, mythically legendary, but I read something a couple weeks ago that made me think, okay, you got that wrong, obviously. And what this blog said was, it's when you understand the mythic rhythms of life, things that happen, the mythic, anyways, you know what I mean? And when you understand them and when you can learn where you are in your life in terms of a mythic story or cycle, then you can learn how to live within that. Have you ever heard anything like that? What do you think of that?
I mean, isn't that what people feel about the hero's journey?
Yes, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, so similar thing.
I think, right? I mean, I've my own ideas about mythic stuff, but we'll save that for later or for another time, maybe. But I think that the idea of sort of myths as true guides to our lives, or as true models of experience. In the same way that I think of this sort of way in which people sometimes default to astrology, and sometimes default to other ways of creating definition. I think that there's value in them, and there are values in those stories, And as a person who practices a religion that is based on we could say has a huge swath of it that's based on stories, right? Nobody in my tradition would tell you, nobody with a solid grounding in reality would tell you, that, as a child of Shango, I'm going to live the myths of Shango, right? And I think that this idea that, that sort of these myths define the arc of human experience, right? I think it's pretty questionable. I think that there is truth in it, right? Like the myth of Parzival, which is so popular amongst, Western initiatory stuff, right? It's like there are pieces of that are true and valuable, and you see most people encounter in some way, right? Like, once the hero decides to go on their journey, something arises to distract them, right? Kundry arrives to distract Parzival from pursuing whatever, right? But the idea that every myth ends with, oh, you were the person you were searching for all along and you had it with you the whole time. I don't think that's true at all, right? I see lots of people whose lives are not that way, right? And, and yet the questions that arise from looking at that myth a bit, like what would distract you from your deeper commitment, right? In what ways are you not already acknowledging your gifts, and so on, right? Like those are powerful questions, but as sort of models for sort of promoting everybody's experience, it's like the hero's journey. I'm like, yeah, maybe for some people, some of the time, but then we're back to this question of like agency and free will, and how much does our expectation that is the course that we're going to continue on then shape the course that we live afterwards, right? And I think that, yeah, so, but so I think that that's a really mixed bag of things, for me, and probably because I did not come out of tarot from that sort of Angeles-Arian sort of archetypes of people, archetypes are what's behind tarot piece, but came from a sort of practical, magical, and sort of ceremonial background into this stuff, and then into a non-Western tradition religiously. I always look at those pieces and I'm kind of like, I get it. I see it. Like I can see how you see it, and I can see how it's there, but it's like what it's defined as seems overstated or incomplete in some way to me, in a way that I've never been able to reconcile it or kind of close the loop on it. So, yeah.
I guess that's why there's a lot of different approaches, because some work for some people and some work for others.
Exactly. Right. And it's, of course, it's not to say that, if people find value in that, then fantastic. Right. Please don't write me. I don't need to have this conversation again. I've had it so many times. But no, I'm not talking about you, but yeah, it's like I've had many people, very smart people, try to convince me or want to have conversations around convincing me about it. I'm like, it's not my jam. I just don't jive with it. So we could just go talk about other things instead, right?
Right. Or yeah, because that's not a really interesting conversation, because trying to convince someone who has especially someone who has a perfectly workable system, and they're not like asking for advice or looking for a new way to live or think. Yeah. It's just evangelizing. And why, just because you believe something is true, the other person doesn't have to think it's true. Mm-hmm. That doesn't diminish its worth for you. Everyone doesn't have to believe the same thing.
Exactly.
So, what might be more interesting would be to say, well, let's talk about what I think and what you think and see if there are any parallels, and maybe talk about where they differ. And isn't that interesting? And why is that?
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. Yeah. I'm curious to hear what your explorations of mythicness bring to you over time, though, for sure.
I know. I have a feeling that next fall, our conversation is going to be super interesting. I mean, not that these haven't been, but these have been personal and hard and important, but and valuable. But I think for next fall, we might, our listeners might get a treat of something different.
Or maybe they'll just get a lovely, what are we at now? 4th helping, 5th helping of, whatever this is. But yeah, we'll figure it out. Time will tell.
That's right.
All right. Well, thanks for making time again, Barbara. I appreciate it as always.
Yes, I did too. I love these conversations.
Mm-hmm, me too. All right, folks. Maybe you're listening to this at some other time, but as the actual release of this is on the 27th of December, I'm going to say thank you all for an amazing 2019, despite all the tremendous drama and challenge in my life. Thank you all for the ongoing success of this podcast. Big thank you to all the Patreons who are out there helping make this happen. Really, it's no joke. It's is it a point of motivation when I run into frustration that I know people are committed in return. And really, everybody, I wish you all the best in 2020. May you find what you're looking for. May you release what you don't need, and may you find happiness, stability, and prosperity everywhere.